All right, good morning. This is where the conference becomes interdisciplinary. I should introduce myself. I'm Jeremy Waldron. I used to teach at Columbia many years ago. I now teach law at NYU, but I'm a moral philosopher by training. And so the methodology is going to be different. The approach is going to be different. Actually, some of the themes with Professor Voss's presentation are very similar, because we're going to be talking about self-control and we're going to be talking about resistance. But most of all, I want to make the topic of this presentation some understanding of constancy, the ability of a person to prescribe a course of conduct for herself and then cleave to that course of conduct no matter what the temptations, desires, inclinations are that arise. One says to oneself, I will adhere to this course of conduct, and you prescribe it articulately to yourself over time, over a lifetime perhaps, whatever contrary inclinations and temptations may present themselves. And the thing that interests me, and the interest I'm going to pursue, is how people can maintain this constancy in themselves when constancy is called for, or can they? How do they motivate it in themselves or in others? In my discipline, a Kantian follower of Immanuel Kant would say that the ability to act on principle and hold to a course of conduct predetermined is a most important part of the noumenal nature of man. We have it in our power. We all have this awe-inspiring capacity. We don't always act on it. Certainly people do fail in constancy from time to time, but that doesn't show that they lack the capacity, only that they have failed to exercise it. What would it be like to entertain doubts on this score? I don't just mean a doubt that one might fail in constancy on a particular occasion by succumbing to this or that temptation along the lines that Professor Voss talked about, or when one is, as they say, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. I mean a broader concern about whether there really was anything like this capacity to remain constant to a course of conduct in one's character to begin with. I'm not a psychologist. My field is legal philosophy and political theory, moral philosophy. But today I want to address these questions from a literary perspective, not for literature's own sake, but to enrich our thoughts and to facilitate reflection on the doubts that I've mentioned and the despair that might come with them. There are, of course, limits to this as an exercise. A novel that I'm going to talk about is not philosophy, it's not psychology, it's not science, it's made up. Still, for the reflective part of whatever is involved in the psychological study of motivation, I think a novelist's reflections can sometimes be useful to our imagination to set the problems that we think it important to solve. The reflections I have in mind are thoughts about constancy in Joseph Conrad's novel, Lord Jim. In this story, a young merchant marine officer, Jim, is on a ship, the Patna. The ship is packed with sleeping pilgrims on the Arabian Sea. They're going for pilgrimage to Mecca. One night the ship hits a hidden obstacle and it appears likely that it will sink. Like the other officers, Jim becomes convinced it will sink, but he's too honourable to do what the other officers, who are all bad men and ruffians, do, which is to lower a boat and flee the ship without waking the passengers. Jim despises the captain and his fellow officers and engineers for their cowardice, for their opportunism, for their dereliction of duty. He prides himself on his constancy. He's steadfastly deaf to their entreaties that he too should jump into the boat. And then, well, as he later blurts out, I had jumped, it seems. I had jumped down onto the lifeboat, the very thing he was priding himself on not doing. Jim too had abandoned ship like the men he despised, leaving the sleeping pilgrims to their fate. In fact, the ship didn't go down, and it made port and reported the abandonment by the officers as a scandal. Well, what are we to say about this? Is it a classic case of what the philosophers call weakness of will? Something that we can take care of by having a special Greek term, akrasia, for it? An exceptional pathology, but perhaps an exception that proves the rule, but no more threatening to our sense of constancy than that. Well, others in the novel didn't think so. There was a man called Montague Brearley, a proud, seasoned, successful sea captain who sat as a marine assessor on the commission of inquiry into Jim's conduct and into the fate of the Patna. The captain and the other officers skedaddled as soon as they reached port, leaving Jim alone to face the music. Braley was a powerful figure on the commission. Imagine somebody sitting up there like an obelisk. The sting of life could do no more to Braley's complacent soul than the scratch of a pin on the smooth face of a rock, said Marlowe, Conrad's narrator. As I looked at him, hearing the evidence, flanking on one side the unassuming pale-faced magistrate who presided, Braley's self-satisfaction presented to me and to the world a surface as hard as granite, says Marlowe. Braley's self-satisfaction presented to me and to the world a surface as hard as granite. He committed suicide very shortly afterwards. Looking back, Marlowe thought that as Braley sat there, bored and complacent in the hearing, listening to Jim's admission of his own revealed weakness, he was probably holding silent inquiry into his own case. The verdict must have been one of unmitigated guilt. If I understand anything of men, the matter was no doubt of the gravest import, one of those trifles that awaken ideas, start into life some thought with which a man unused to such a companionship finds it impossible to live. And Marlowe himself, the narrator, keeps wondering why he kept going back every day to the hearing as an interested spectator, grubbing into the deplorable details of an occurrence which, after all, concerned me no more than as a member of an obscure body of men, merchant marine officers, held together by a community of inglorious toil. And he came up with this. Perhaps unconsciously, I hoped I would find some merciful explanation, some convincing shadow of an excuse. I see well enough now that I hope for the impossible, for the laying of what is the most obstinate ghost of man's creation, of the uneasy doubt uprising like a mist, secret and gnawing like a worm, and more chilling than the certitude of death. And then this is my title, The Doubt of the Sovereign Power Enthroned in a Fixed Standard of Conduct. It's the hardest thing to stumble against, said Marlowe. It's a thing that breeds yelling panics and a good little quiet villainies. It's the true shadow of calamity, the doubt of the sovereign power enthroned in a fixed standard of conduct. And that's the issue that I want to talk about. We pride ourselves on our autonomy. It's our special Kantian dignity that we can give a law to ourselves and hold ourselves to a principle. We stand proud on the assumption that a resolution undertaken by a well-formed character is proof against a myriad of temptations. I mean, I know that this is a fantasy, especially even when we're working with the language of everyday life and desire and resistance. It's a fantasy. But we pride ourselves that we can act on principle, and we denounce people who do not. But suppose Jim's jump. I had jumped, it seems. His dereliction is characteristic, not pathological. Suppose no one can count on or vouch for their own steadfastness. That's what made Marlowe wake up screaming in the middle of the night. That's what led Big Braley to slip overboard barely a week after the end of the inquiry. It's important to be clear about the concern here, doubt of the sovereign power enthroned in a fixed standard of conduct. I've seen critics of the novel reduce the point to banality. He's just doubting whether anybody can fulfill the obligations of the merchant marine. And of course the moral norms of the merchant marine are among the things at stake here. Officers stay with their ships. Not like that Italian guy who overturned the ship, you remember? Yeah. But Marlowe's concern is so much deeper and broader. He's concerned about the ability of an individual, any individual, to hold fast to a standard of conduct, any standard of conduct that he has fixed for himself, for his own sake or for the sake of others, whether it concerns the ethics of the merchant marine or not, or standing away from social media or alcohol or not. It's a perfectly general concern. Can any of us stand our ground, keep our promises, give earnest for ourselves? It's not even just a question of fear and cowardice, though it is that, at least, for an elderly French lieutenant whom Marlowe met in Sydney, the issue was fear. Jim ran away. He was frightened. One is always afraid, said the lieutenant. One may talk, but the fear, look you, it is always there. One talks, this is all very fine, but at the end of the reckoning, one is no cleverer than the next man and no more brave. Each of us, if he were an honest man, would confess there is a point, for the best of us, there is somewhere a point where you just let go of everything. Given a certain combination of circumstances, fear is sure to come. This is insightful. Fear of the event, fear of ourselves. At my age, said the elderly lieutenant, one knows what one is talking about. Insightful though this is, the challenge raised by Jim's case is more than this. It's not even clear that Jim did jump out of fear. He doesn't know why he jumped. I had jumped, it seems. But when we think about the constancy that's at stake here, we also have to think not just about great fear, but also small distractions, our current desires, daydreams, even daydreams about heroic devotion to duty, or perhaps just forgetfulness. I don't know whether you know Nietzsche's The Genealogy of Morals, but at the beginning of Book 2 there, he suggests that one of the greatest tasks the human race ever set for itself was to overcome natural, positive forgetfulness and enable to sear into the consciousness the ability to hold fast and to remember that one has resolved to hold fast. Wonderful description, terrible description by Nietzsche of the burnings and mutilations that must have been necessary to burn this into the human psyche. If you tell a dog, stay there and then walk away, the dog may stay there for a few seconds and will just wander off, not because it's renounced its resolution, but there's no resolution there at all. What Jim's case leads Marlowe to doubt is something very general in moral psychology. What grip do our resolutions have on us? How do we know what grip they have? What power can they have over us, impulsive, hasty, forgetful, and vacillating as we are? The subject of Marlowe's doubt is the effect that our fixing a standard of conduct has on what we subsequently do, the sovereign power enthroned in a fixed standard of conduct. The concern is not that we fail to recognize the authority of the resolutions that we've made. We can remember them, all right, and think about them. That's the easy part, which is not to say that it always happens. Jim recognizes the authority of his resolution all too well. He's standing there, priding himself on it. He utterly identifies with it. He does not question what it commands him to do. He stands fast in accordance with and with respect for the authority of his resolution, and then, well, I had jumped, it seems. It's the resolution's power that's in question once its authority has been granted. Moreover, what's at stake is its sovereign power. By this, I take it, Marlowe means its hegemony over all other springs of conduct. One says to oneself, whatever else moves me, whatever desires crop up, I will not be moved by impulse or desire from this course of conduct. The adoption of that resolution, its coronation, the recognition of its authority, its enthronement is there indisputably. There's no problem with that. It's just that it fails, and the failure when it comes is just inexplicable. Of the exact moment, says Marlowe, of the cause that tore him out of his immobility, he knew no more than the uprooted tree knows of the wind that laid it low. There's no transparency here at this level. And what tortures Jim and tortures the narrator is that there is nothing for remorse or rebuilding to get a hold on. All one can do is recommit oneself again, and this time the failure may not occur, or it may. No sense that there's a technique involved here. This is too what troubled Braley. It's the man who slipped overboard a few weeks later. Such an affair destroys one's confidence. A man may go pretty near his whole sea life without any call to show a stiff upper lip, but when the call comes, well, aha. As the editor of the Penguin edition remarks, his suicide a few days later confirms that an untested career, however brilliant, is one that cannot be relied on. And notice how different, I mean, you are mercifully not exposed to this nonsense, but notice how different this is from the philosopher's account of weakness of will. The philosopher asks, once a person has correctly apprehended the reasons in favor of a course of action, how is it possible for him to fail to act on that apprehension, given that the correct apprehension of the conclusion of a practical syllogism is something like an intention to act? Or never mind this cognitive sounding talk about reasons, the philosopher may ask, once a person has resolved on a course of conduct, committed himself more or less intentionally, how is it possible for him to fail to do what he's committed himself to do? Puzzled by the failure, the philosopher has no choice but to redirect his inquiry back to the genuineness of the apprehension, or the resolution in the particular case. He has no doubt that a genuine apprehension of the reasons, or a genuine resolution would, as a matter of course, yield the appropriate conduct. I think we know better. And the question explored in Lord Jim is whether we know anything about genuineness in this area, indeed whether we know anything at all about the psychological mechanisms that resolution and its unraveling involve. It may not, thank you very much. It may not just be a question of psychological opacity. Maybe there's nothing to know. The problem may be almost Wittgensteinian. I mean, the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations, who is skeptical about subjective internal rule following. My confidence that I'm using the same rule over and over again to identify colours, or to identify courses of action, or to define the rules of a game that only I play for myself. Does it make sense to say that I can enthrone a course of conduct in myself just by doing or saying or thinking certain things? I say certain things, I answer certain questions when asked, and I stand straight and I brace my shoulders and I look fierce or serious or something. We take it as something like this along with certain mental events is what it means to commit oneself to a course of conduct. But how do I know that this is what I have done when I've done this dance and had these strings of words flowing through my consciousness? And how would I recognize the appropriate mental event and hang on to it if I am distracted from that course of action or wander away forgetfully or flee in fear? Can we say confidently that I was until that point indeed committed, although I lapsed or deviated from the standard I committed myself to? Or does my behavior reveal that I was never really committed at all? Is there something that could count as a difference here, except a verbal self-report? Is there something that could count as a difference here? Is there anything I could have done differently? Different posture, different words, different lines of text flowing through my consciousness? In contradistinction to what I did earlier, is there something, some different posture, different words, different mental events that would count as my now having really committed myself, as opposed to the fake commitment I did before? And even if there is, or even if we say there is, what if I still wander off? Or what if it seems I still jump? The elderly French officer I mentioned in Conrad's story has a different solution. Cleaving constantly to a fixed course of conduct is not something one can do on one's own. Professor Voss talked about others doing what you crave, and this being a factor that interferes with resistance. I'd be interested to consider also the converse of that, is that others standing by with you, doing what you fiercely resolve. We think and admire the solitary man or woman of principle, but in a way it's Jim's isolation, his loneliness, his self-absorption that is the problem. Man is born a coward, says the old French lieutenant. It is a difficulty, parbleu. It would be too easy otherwise. But habit, necessity, do you see, the eyes of others, voila, one puts up with it. And then the example of others who are no better than yourself and yet make good countenance. And the others for whom the same questions arise are thinking exactly the same about you. His voice ceased, he drew up his heavy eyelids. Pardon, he said punctiliously. Allow me, I contended that one may get on knowing very well that one's courage does not come of itself. One stands with others. There's nothing much in that to get upset about. Our inquiry is about a solitary person maintaining, in circumstances of adverse solitude, a course of conduct. And it struck me as interesting that the respondents, although we asked whether there were others, the struggle was internal to each of them alone. The constancy we're looking for, perhaps it does not come of itself, but comes in a form of life that we practice with others, not in our prehistory as with Nietzsche, but in our present predicaments. In a way, every military commander knows this, that unit solidarity of 6, 10, 20 people, none of whom is constant in himself, can somehow manufacture, again we know not how, a sense of constancy that's shared among them, not perfectly. So maybe it's a matter of solidarity, not inner motivation. And if that is true, and I guess this is one message from Conrad, then heaven help the man who has to stand on his own resources when everything coming from others is beckoning towards dereliction, beckoning what is in itself, considered by itself, his fickle and ethereal agency in the other direction. Well, Lord Jim, as I said, is just a story. Joseph Conrad drew it from a contemporary news report that the characters and the reality or otherwise of their inner lives he just made up. As I said at the beginning, we can draw nothing from it in the way of a case study. This is just made up stuff. We can allow it, however, to shake us a little, not by filling us with fantastic horror as a Gothic novel might, but reminding us of certain doubts that we do sometimes entertain. I mean, in the small hours of the morning, never in a seminar like this, never in front of our peers, but doubts that make Conrad's story credible or resonant. Doubts the enormity of whose implications in Conrad's story might rightly lead us to wonder, at least in the back of our minds, whether we really understand anything about motivation in this area of constancy at all. That's the end of this bit of the interdisciplinary. Thank you very much.